I didn't set out to reconstruct a civilization that supposedly never existed. But when you spend enough time examining the architectural remains, the industrial artifacts, the photographic evidence from the mid-1800s through early 1900s, you begin to notice something unsettling. Not just what's there, but what's missing. The absence of explanation. The gaps in the historical record. I realized something profoundly unsettling. The story we've been told about daily life in the 1800s doesn't match the physical evidence. Not the buildings that remain. Not the infrastructure still visible beneath our streets. Not the photographs that show a world far more sophisticated than we've been led to believe. So I started asking a different question. Not did Tartaria exist, but rather, what would daily life have looked like in a civilization that left behind these structures? This is an investigation into what life might have actually looked like during the period we're told was primitive, pre-industrial backwards, a period when, according to official history, most people lived in squalor, travelled by horse, communicated by letter, and built with simple tools. But when you examine what actually remains, the roads too perfectly graded, the canals too precisely engineered, the buildings too mathematically exact, a different picture emerges. Not of primitive struggle, but of coordinated movement. Not of isolation, but of connection. Not of simplicity, but of systems we've somehow forgotten how to recognize. What was daily life like in this forgotten world? What did people actually do? How did they move, work, trade, and live within structures that seem designed for purposes we no longer understand? The official narrative collapses the moment you ask these questions. Imagine waking in a Tartarian city at dawn, not in some romanticized past, but in the actual physical spaces that remain. The apartment buildings with their impossible ceiling heights, 12, 14, 16 feet, far beyond any practical heating consideration. The windows so tall they seem designed for giants, or perhaps for something else entirely. Light distribution, air circulation, atmospheric pressure regulation. You rise in a room with crown moulding so intricate it would take modern craftsmen months to replicate. Plasterwork that flows like frozen water. Geometric patterns that repeat with mathematical precision across thousands of buildings, in dozens of cities, on multiple continents, all supposedly built by individual contractors working independently, all arriving at identical solutions. Ask yourself, how does that happen? The morning light enters through windows positioned not randomly but deliberately, aligned with solar angles, calculated for seasonal variation. The entire structure seems oriented toward natural forces, wind, sun, water flow, in ways our modern buildings completely ignore. You dress in clothing we see in photographs, formal, layered, deliberately constructed. Not primitive homespun, but manufactured textiles showing industrial scale production. Cotton from India, silk from Asia, wool from Australia, all available in provincial cities thousands of miles from production centres. All arriving with suspicious regularity, as if moved through distribution networks far more sophisticated than horse-drawn wagons could support. The question becomes impossible to avoid. What infrastructure made this possible? If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider subscribing or becoming a YouTube member. This kind of research takes hundreds of hours in archives most historians never examine. Your support makes it possible to continue asking the questions conventional history refuses to address. You step outside into streets that pose their own mysteries, not dirt paths, not cobblestones randomly placed, but precisely graded thoroughfares with drainage systems so sophisticated they still function today, over a century later. Storm drains that connect to underground networks extending for miles, sewage systems that rival modern engineering, water distribution channels that supplied entire cities with pressurized flow, all supposedly built in the span of a few decades, all across the world, all following identical principles. The streets themselves reveal the pattern. Too wide for simple cart traffic, too perfectly aligned with cardinal directions to be accidental. In city after city, you find the same layout, grand boulevards radiating from central points, creating geometric patterns visible only from above, star formations, radial designs, mathematical precision that suggests central planning on a scale we're told didn't exist. And the movement along these streets, here's where the official story becomes impossible to sustain. Photographs from the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s show streets filled with traffic. Not chaotic medieval congestion, but organised flow. Streetcars running on rails with electrical or cable systems requiring massive infrastructure investment. Omnibuses on fixed routes implying coordinated scheduling. Carriages, yes, but moving through a system, not wandering randomly. The deeper I looked, the more I found evidence of transportation networks we've been taught emerged only later. Street railways in hundreds of cities by the 1880s, cable car systems requiring underground machinery, elevated trains in major centres, all appearing with suspicious simultaneity, all requiring engineering expertise supposedly unavailable. Who coordinated this? Who planned it? Who possessed the surveying capability, the mathematical knowledge, the organisational capacity to implement identical systems across continents? The silence in the historical record is deafening. But the streets were only one system. The canals reveal something even more perplexing. I spent months examining canal records across Europe, Asia and North America. Not the famous ones, the Erie Canal, the Suez, but the thousands of smaller waterways connecting cities, towns, industrial centres. The network was vast, coordinated, precisely engineered with lock systems, water level management, seasonal flow regulation. The Grand Canal in China, over 1,000 miles connecting major river systems, moving goods and people with efficiency that wouldn't be matched until rail. The canal networks of the Netherlands, Belgium, northern France, hundreds of miles of interconnected waterways with standardised dimensions suggesting unified planning. The British canal system at its peak, 4,000 miles of navigable waterways, all built in roughly 60 years, all compatible, all precisely graded. This wasn't primitive infrastructure, this was systems engineering. Barges moved along these canals with cargoes we can track through port records, grain from the interior, manufactured goods from cities, raw materials to factories. The volume was staggering. Single barges carrying loads that would require dozens of wagons, networks moving thousands of tons daily, all coordinated through a system of schedules, toll points, transfer stations that implied central administration. And here's the strangest part. The engineering required to maintain these networks was extraordinary. Water level management across hundreds of miles, lock systems synchronized to allow passage, pumping stations to move water uphill, reservoir systems to manage seasonal variation. Where did this expertise come from? How did it spread so rapidly? Why does the historical record show no learning curve, no period of experimentation, but rather fully formed systems appearing almost simultaneously? The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Beyond the canals, beyond the streets, another system operated. The overland trade routes, we're told, were primitive merchant trails were, in fact, sophisticated corridors of movement. The Silk Road wasn't a single path, but a network of routes with established stations, water sources, rest points positioned at precise intervals. Not random stops, but planned infrastructure. Russian archives contain references to caravans crossing Central Asia with hundreds of camels, moving goods worth fortunes, operating on schedules that required coordination across thousands of miles. These weren't wandering merchants. These were organised enterprises moving through established systems. The stations along these routes pose their own questions. Caravans in Persia, Central Asia, Turkey, massive structures with courtyards capable of housing hundreds of travellers and animals. Water systems, storage facilities, defensive walls, all built to identical specifications, as if following architectural standards distributed across empires. Inside these structures you find evidence of the trade itself. Goods from China appearing in European markets, European manufacturers reaching Asian cities, African products distributed across continents, all moving through networks requiring organization we're told didn't exist. The coordination problem becomes overwhelming. How do you synchronize movement across continents without communication technology? How do you establish trade standards, currency exchange, contract enforcement across linguistic and cultural boundaries? How do you move valuable goods thousands of miles through multiple jurisdictions without centralized authority? The official explanation that this somehow emerged organically collapses under examination. And then there are the airships. This is where conventional historians stop listening, where the documented evidence becomes too uncomfortable to acknowledge. But the records exist. Patent applications for dirigibles, balloons, lighter than aircraft throughout the mid-1800s, newspaper accounts of aerial exhibitions, engineering journals discussing propulsion systems, gas production, navigation techniques, photographs showing structures that could only be airship mooring stations, tall masts atop buildings, anchoring points, elevated platforms. I'm not claiming massive fleets. I'm not suggesting routine aerial commerce. But the evidence suggests experimentation, development, limited deployment of lighter-than-air transportation that has been systematically erased from mainstream historical narrative. Why? Consider the implications. If even limited airship travel existed, it changes everything about information distribution, reconnaissance, rapid elite movement. It suggests a level of technological sophistication incompatible with the primitive narrative we've inherited. The buildings themselves hint at this. Rooftop structures with no apparent purpose, elevated platforms on government buildings, architectural elements that make sense only if you imagine them as landing or mooring points for aerial craft. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Accounts from World's Fairs, the Paris Exposition, the Chicago Columbian Exposition, describe aerial demonstrations, tethered balloons carrying passengers, discussions of future aerial navigation. Then, after 1900, these references largely disappear. Not because the technology failed, but because something changed in how we documented technological development. What happened? What shifted? Why does the historical record show such a dramatic discontinuity? But daily life happened inside these structures, and that's where the mystery deepens. The buildings themselves reveal functions we've been taught to ignore. Not just homes, not just factories, but spaces designed for specific purposes we no longer recognize. The basements extend far deeper than necessary for storage. Multi-level underground chambers with brick archways, drainage systems, mysterious equipment mounts. Official history calls them cellars or foundation spaces, but the engineering is too deliberate. Sealed chambers, pressure-resistant walls, connection points for pipes leading to unknown destinations. The main floors show evidence of built-in systems we've removed and forgotten. Wall cavities too large for simple utilities. Shaft systems extending through multiple stories. Central courtyards with glass ceilings suggesting light wells, but engineered with such precision they must have served additional purposes. The upper floors pose their own questions. Ceiling heights that decrease as you ascend. Why? Ventilation systems far more sophisticated than required for simple air circulation. Rooftop structures with astronomical alignments suggesting observation or measurement purposes, and throughout the ornamentation. Not decorative flourishes, but mathematical patterns, geometric progressions, symbolic systems that repeat across continents. Official history dismisses this as architectural style, but the precision suggests meaning we've lost. The rhythm of daily work reveals the most troubling anomalies. The factories we're shown in photographs aren't primitive workshops. They're massive structures with floor-to-ceiling machinery, precision equipment, assembly systems requiring coordination across hundreds of workers. The scale of production appears immediately, with no transition period, no gradual mechanization. textile mills in New England producing millions of yards of fabric annually by the 1830s, steel foundries in Germany operating at industrial scale by the 1850s, ceramic factories in England, glassworks in Bohemia, chemical plants in France, all appearing within decades, all requiring expertise supposedly unavailable. The workforce presents its own mystery. Photographs show workers in these facilities dressed formally, operating complex machinery with apparent expertise. Where did the training come from? How did thousands of workers across multiple industries simultaneously acquire specialized knowledge? The official story speaks of industrial revolution, of gradual technological progress, of inventors and entrepreneurs driving change. But the physical evidence suggests something different: inherited systems, repurposed infrastructure, technology deployed rather than developed. Inside these factories, you find equipment that shouldn't exist: precision metalworking machinery requiring tolerances measurable in thousandths of an inch, hydraulic systems operating at pressures modern engineers respect, electrical generation equipment appearing decades before Edison, chemical processes requiring knowledge of molecular structures supposedly unknown, and the coordination across facilities, standardized parts appearing in the 1850s, interchangeable components manufactured in different cities, different countries, all compatible, assembly line techniques emerging simultaneously in multiple industries, all requiring systems thinking, central planning. Information distribution, we're told, didn't exist. The evidence suggests something much larger than individual invention. Daily commerce in these cities reveals the deepest mystery: markets operating with price coordination across continents, goods arriving from thousands of miles away with predictable regularity, currency exchange systems allowing transactions across dozens of monetary standards, credit instruments, bills of exchange, commercial contracts implying sophisticated financial infrastructure. This wasn't barter. This wasn't simple trade. This was integrated commerce requiring information technology, we're told, came only with telegraph and telephone. Yet the records show coordinated pricing, synchronized commodity movements, arbitrage opportunities exploited across oceanic distances, all before electronic communication. How? The market buildings themselves tell part of the story. Grand structures with climate control systems, refrigeration capabilities, storage facilities, engineered for specific goods. Not primitive stalls, but organized exchanges with administrative overhead, regulatory frameworks, standardized measurements. The deeper I investigated, the more I found evidence of commercial networks operating with clockwork precision. Tea from China arriving in London on schedule, cotton from America processed in Manchester mills, grain from Ukraine feeding European cities, all moving through systems requiring coordination that seems impossible without modern technology. And the financial instruments, letters of credit honoured across empires, insurance contracts covering shipments worldwide, investment syndicates funding projects on multiple continents, all requiring trust, verification, enforcement mechanisms that imply institutional structures we've been taught didn't exist. The coordination problem becomes mathematically impossible to explain through conventional means. The question of how society was organized reveals layers of mystery. Official history presents the 1800s as a period of emerging democracy, declining aristocracy, rising middle class. But the physical evidence, the buildings, the infrastructure, the coordination of massive projects suggests administrative capacity far beyond what electoral governments supposedly commanded. Who planned the cities? Who coordinated the canal networks? Who standardized the railways? Who enforced the commercial regulations? The buildings provide clues. Administrative structures in every major city, imposing edifices with record-keeping facilities, communication centres, assembly halls, not primitive town halls but sophisticated bureaucratic centres, implying extensive governmental apparatus. Membership organisations appear everywhere in the records: trade guilds, professional societies, fraternal orders, philosophical associations, all operating internationally, all maintaining communications, all seemingly coordinating activity across political boundaries. The pattern suggests parallel structures of authority, not replacing official governments but operating alongside them, coordinating the systems that made daily life function. Standards bodies, professional certifications, technical protocols. These organizations left minimal documentation. Their activities were considered internal matters, but their influence appears in the uniformity of outcomes, identical building codes across nations, standardized engineering practices on multiple continents, coordinated responses to technical challenges. When you map these networks, when you trace the connections between cities, institutions, projects, a picture emerges of organizational capacity that official history cannot explain. Daily cultural life poses questions historians prefer to avoid. Ideas spread too quickly. Architectural styles appearing simultaneously in distant cities. Musical trends emerging in multiple countries within months. Literary movements, philosophical concepts, scientific theories distributed across continents with suspicious rapidity. Before telegraph, before telephone, before wireless. The official explanation invokes mail systems, travelling intellectuals, published journals. But the timeline doesn't work. The synchronicity is too precise. Examine the world's fairs, massive international exhibitions coordinating participation from dozens of nations, displaying technologies supposedly in early development, demonstrating organizational capacity requiring years of planning and communication. The 1851 Crystal Palace Exhibition, the 1889 Paris Exposition, the 1893 Chicago Columbian Exposition, all involving global coordination on scales that seem impossible. The buildings constructed for these exhibitions reveal the deepest mystery. Temporary structures supposedly, yet engineered with permanent precision. The Crystal Palace, nearly 1 million square feet of glass and iron, constructed in months, then disassembled and relocated. The Paris exhibition structures, elaborate buildings covering hundreds of acres, appearing as if conjured, then disappearing from the historical record. Where did the expertise come from? Where did it go? Cultural products themselves show the pattern. Sheet music published simultaneously in New York, London, Paris, Vienna. Books appearing in multiple languages within weeks. Fashion trends spreading across oceans before photographs could document them. Scientific discoveries announced in different countries on the same day. The evidence suggests information distribution systems we've been taught didn't exist. As the workday ended and people returned home, they entered spaces filled with technologies that shouldn't exist. Gas lighting systems requiring underground distribution networks, indoor plumbing connected to pressurized water systems, heating systems with thermostatic controls, ventilation networks regulating air quality, all supposedly primitive, yet engineered with sophistication, modern buildings struggle to match. The gas systems alone pose overwhelming questions. How do you distribute combustible gas safely through hundreds of miles of underground pipes? How do you regulate pressure across a network serving thousands of buildings? How do you manage seasonal demand variation? How do you prevent leaks, explosions, contamination? Yet by the 1850s, major cities possessed these systems fully operational. Not experimental, not developing, but mature infrastructure serving entire populations. The water systems show even more sophisticated engineering. Reservoir construction requiring geological surveys, aqueduct systems spanning dozens of miles, filtration facilities employing chemical processes, distribution networks with pressure regulation, flow control, contamination prevention, all appearing within decades across dozens of cities following identical principles. Inside homes, the evidence of coordination continues. Standardized fixtures, compatible fittings, interchangeable parts, all suggesting manufacturing coordination, distribution systems, commercial networks operating at industrial scale, before the supposed industrial revolution reached maturity. The domestic space reveals the final impossibility. How did ordinary people, working ordinary jobs, afford these technologies? How did infrastructure requiring massive capital investment serve middle-class populations? How did systems demanding constant maintenance, skilled operation, technical support become ubiquitous? The economics don't work unless something fundamental is missing from our understanding. After dark, the city transformed. Street lighting appeared far earlier than official history acknowledges. Not primitive oil lamps, but organized systems with central control, standardized fixtures, coordinated maintenance. By the 1860s, major cities possessed street lighting networks covering miles of thoroughfares. The power sources raise immediate questions. Gas required underground distribution. Electric required generation facilities, distribution networks, voltage regulation. Arc lighting required precision equipment, carbon electrodes, current control. All supposedly in primitive development, yet deployed at urban scale. Photographs from the period showed nighttime activity incompatible with primitive lighting. Streets filled with traffic after dark. Commercial districts operating late hours. Public spaces illuminated for safety and navigation. All requiring infrastructure investment that seems economically impossible. And the buildings themselves illuminate mysteries. Windows glowing with interior light powered by systems, we're told, were barely experimental. Entire facades lit for display or orientation. Rooftop lights visible for miles, suggesting navigation or signaling purposes. Who coordinated this? Who funded it? Who possessed the technical knowledge to implement electrical systems decades before Edison, Tesla, and Westinghouse supposedly pioneered the technology? The pattern repeats, mature systems appearing without documented development, spreading without apparent diffusion mechanism, operating with expertise that seems inherited rather than invented. This brings us to the central question this investigation cannot escape. What happened to the knowledge? Not just technical knowledge, engineering principles, manufacturing techniques, coordination protocols, but the conceptual frameworks that made these systems possible. The understanding of how to organize cities, move populations, distribute goods, coordinate commerce across continents. The discontinuity is stark. Examine engineering journals from the 1880s, and you find sophisticated discussions of hydraulic systems, atmospheric pressure applications, energy distribution networks. By 1920, these discussions have largely disappeared, replaced by different paradigms, different assumptions, different technologies. It's as if an entire knowledge base was systematically replaced. Building techniques show the same pattern. 19th century structures demonstrate construction methods we can no longer replicate economically. Not because we lack tools, but because we've lost the systematic knowledge of material properties, structural principles, integrated design thinking that made those buildings possible. The infrastructure reveals it most clearly. We excavate basements and find network systems we don't understand. We demolish buildings and discover mechanical apparatus we can't identify. We examine water management systems and recognize engineering sophistication we struggle to duplicate. This wasn't primitive technology gradually improving. This was sophisticated knowledge systematically forgotten. Ask yourself why. Why would advanced capabilities be abandoned? Why would efficient systems be replaced with inferior alternatives? Why would coordinated networks be dismantled in favor of fragmented solutions? The official narrative offers no answers because it denies the premise. We're told there was nothing to lose, that progress moved linearly forward, that each generation built upon the previous with steady advancement. But the physical evidence contradicts this completely. What did daily life feel like as this knowledge disappeared? Imagine living through the transition. Growing up in cities with comprehensive infrastructure, coordinated systems, sophisticated technologies. then watching them dismantled, replaced, forgotten. Seeing the canal networks abandoned for railways. The gas systems replaced by inferior electrical grids. The architectural knowledge lost as standardized construction replaced integrated design. The records from the early 1900s contain hints of this, complaints about deteriorating services, nostalgia for better days, references to capabilities that existed within living memory but were no longer available. Older residents remembering when the streets were cleaner, the water purer, the air less polluted, when systems worked seamlessly rather than requiring constant intervention, when cities felt designed rather than accumulated, but these voices were marginalized, dismissed as romantic reminiscence of an imagined past. The narrative of progress demanded that everything improve continuously. Any suggestion that capabilities had been lost threatened the fundamental story of modernity. So the knowledge faded, the skills disappeared. The understanding of integrated systems thinking gave way to specialized expertise in narrower domains. The holistic approach to urban design was replaced by single-function solutions, and within a generation, the memory faded sufficiently that we could look at the inherited infrastructure and claim we built it. Look at the sophisticated engineering and declare it primitive. Look at the coordinated systems and insist they emerged randomly. The rhythm of forgetting has its own momentum. Once begun, it accelerates. Today, you can still see the evidence if you know where to look. The buildings that haven't been renovated into unrecognizability, the underground infrastructure exposed during construction projects, the canal systems still visible in satellite imagery, the railway grades that follow alignments too perfect for trial and error surveying, the street layouts that reveal geometric patterns from above. Walk through older cities with this perspective, and the anomalies become overwhelming. Building after building showing capabilities that don't match the official timeline. Infrastructure after infrastructure revealing coordination that shouldn't exist. System after system displaying sophistication we're told came later. The pattern is consistent. What remains is more advanced than what replaced it. 19th century railway stations with acoustic engineering modern architects struggle to achieve. Victorian water systems with pressure regulation contemporary infrastructure can't match. Industrial buildings with natural climate control or mechanized systems fail to duplicate. This isn't nostalgia. This isn't romantic reminiscence. This is measurable, documentable, physical evidence that the narrative of continuous progress is fundamentally incomplete. Something existed, something sophisticated, something coordinated, something we've been taught never was. And the question becomes unavoidable. What else have we forgotten? I began this investigation expecting to document daily life in a historical period I thought I understood. I discovered instead a mystery that deepens with every archive visited, every photograph examined, every building measured. What was life like in the cities we call Tartarian? It was, the evidence suggests, more coordinated than we've been told, more sophisticated than official history acknowledges, more interconnected than the available technology supposedly allowed. People moved through systems we can barely comprehend, worked with technologies we've forgotten how to replicate, lived in spaces designed for purposes we no longer recognize, participated in networks of trade, communication and organization that seem impossible without capabilities we're told didn't exist. And then something changed. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but systematically, deliberately, as if by design. The knowledge faded, the systems were dismantled, the infrastructure abandoned or repurposed. The understanding of how it all worked together disappeared into obscurity. Within a few generations, we couldn't remember. We looked at what remained and invented new stories to explain it, stories that fit our preferred narrative of progress, of invention, of continuous advancement from primitive to modern. But the buildings remember, the streets remember, the canals, the railways, the underground networks, they all remember a different story. A story of coordination without communication technology, organization without electronic systems, sophisticated engineering without modern tools, global networks without contemporary transportation. A story we've been systematically taught to forget. The question isn't whether this world existed. The evidence is overwhelming and physical and impossible to dismiss. The question is why we've been so determined not to see it. Why does acknowledging sophisticated 19th century capabilities threaten our modern identity? Why must we insist that everything before us was primitive, limited, backward? Why can't we accept that knowledge is sometimes lost, that civilizations sometimes forget, that progress isn't always linear? What are we protecting by maintaining the official narrative? And more troubling, what else have we forgotten? What other capabilities existed that we can no longer recognize? What other systems operated that we've trained ourselves not to see? The buildings stand waiting for someone to ask the right questions. The infrastructure remains silent testimony to knowledge we've misplaced. The photographs preserve moments from a world we claim never existed. But it did exist. People lived in it, worked in it, moved through it daily, built lives within systems we've convinced ourselves were impossible. And somewhere in the archives, in the basement storage rooms, in the forgotten engineering journals, the documentation waits. The evidence accumulates. The pattern becomes undeniable. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The only question remaining is whether we're willing to look. This investigation continues. The archives are deep, the evidence vast, the questions multiplying. If you want to support this research, consider becoming a member or subscribing. Because the deeper we look, the more we find that history isn't what we've been told. And that truth, perhaps, is what we've been forgetting all along.